Hello, everybody. You are very welcome to today's IIEA webinar. I'm Seamus Allen, a researcher here at the IIEA, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Felicia Anthonio and Zach Rosson from Access Now for today's event, Internet Shutdowns, Endangered Communities, Silent Stories. Felicia and Zach will speak to us for about 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then we'll go to a discussion and a Q&A. You can join the Q&A using the button on the bottom of your screen. You can feel free to send in questions throughout the presentation, and we'll come to them once the speakers have finished. A reminder that the event today and the Q&A are both on the record. I'll now briefly introduce our two speakers. So Felicia Anthonio is the KeepItOn Campaign Manager at Access Now. She's written and published widely on the subject of internet shutdowns, and she hosts the Kill Switch podcast on the same subject. She is also an advisory council member at the Open Technology Fund and a board member for the World Expression Forum. Zach is the research lead and data analyst for the KeepItOn campaign at Access Now, and he's a background in research in private sector data analytics, computational research, and seismology. The KeepItOn campaign is a coalition of more than 300 organizations that campaign against internet shutdowns. Felicia and Zach, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'll now hand over to both of you.
Thank you so much, Seamus, for having us. And it's a great pleasure for both of us to be talking about our work with regards to advocacy against internet shutdowns. As you rightly said, the KeepItOn Coalition has over 345 organizations as members now. It was launched in 2016 by Access Now and our partners. The reason why we launched this was in response to the issue of internet shutdown, remembering from the Arab Spring, a number of shutdowns were imposed. And so in response to that, we launched this campaign. And since then, we continue to unite and organize local and international efforts to end internet shutdowns. Our advocacy is also guided by a working definition, and Zach would be speaking to that very shortly, which we adopted in 2016 when the campaign was launched. We also have been monitoring internet shutdowns over the years, and every year we produce an annual report looking at the trends and developments, as well as the impacts of internet shutdowns around the globe. And we also have a data set from 2016 that showcases incidents of shutdowns documented across the world. So in this webinar, we'll be highlighting the findings of our 2024 report, as well as providing some brief updates with regards to what is happening in 2025. And then, of course, we'll also talk about some of the strategies that we use as a coalition in the fight against internet shutdowns. So I'll hand over to Zach to take us through the key findings of our 2024 report.
Yeah, thank you, Felicia. Thank you, Seamus. Really appreciate everyone joining today. We'll definitely have a nice chunk of information from our 2020 or 2024 report, as well as some kind of trends as to how we got here and then what 2025 is looking like. So what do we mean by an internet shutdown? So this is a definition that was determined by the KeepItOn Coalition back in 2016, and it's really kind of stuck. It's defined as an intentional disruption of internet or electronic communications, rendering them inaccessible or effectively unusable for a specific population or within a location, often to exert control over the flow of information. So even though the forms of internet shutdowns have changed a lot over the years, this has really been a kind of catch-all to really define what we mean by shutdowns. You also might hear them referred to as blackouts, kill switches, or network disruptions. Thinking about what falls under our definition, when there's a complete or blanket shutdown, if access is significantly throttled or degraded, or it's kind of partially shut down. There can also be a range of geographic locations impacted by a shutdown, whole countries down to individual neighborhoods. And we also track blocked access to what we refer to as two-way communication platforms. So social media, messaging, these are all actively considered internet shutdowns. For millions of people around the world, these platforms are sometimes all they consider is the internet. They're accessing these apps through their phones, and that is their entire consideration of what the internet is. And considering that they're huge enablers of internet access and communication, and a range of human rights, we consider them under our definition. As far as the sources we use, it's a range of quantitative, like internet measurement sources, open sources, as well as news reports, published shutdown orders from governments, down to individual tips from human rights defenders and activists that we partner with. So yeah, the definition of shutdowns and all this information, as well as our whole methodology for our shutdown tracker optimization project, or STOP. We can share all those resources. I think they're linked at the end of this briefing, so you can explore the data. There are nearly 1,800 shutdowns in our data set, so it's a pretty comprehensive group of information. Now, looking at the trends. Okay, so we've defined an internet shutdown. How many are there and where are they? Where are they, right? So this is the trend since 2016 when we began tracking. As you can see in 2024, there's nearly 4 times the number of shutdowns than there were in 2016. So obviously our capabilities, I wouldn't say obviously, but our capabilities for measuring and identifying and tracking shutdowns is greatly improved. However, we've retroactively added a lot of data. So this is our most complete information that we have to date. But there's just a really, really alarming number of shutdowns happening globally and happening in more and more countries. There's a group of offenders that you'll start to see a list of soon. The maintained shutdowns that last over months to years. There's a group of countries where they'll impose dozens of shutdowns, sometimes many shutdowns each year repeatedly. There's also a group of new offenders that will join the fray. We consider these events to be very sadly normalized, but we also consider that unacceptable as a coalition and organization, as internet is a huge enabler of a wide spectrum of human rights. So here's a map of and a list of where people experience shutdowns in 2024. So the top 4 countries here with the highest numbers accounted for about 71% of all shutdowns globally, or 209 shutdowns. So there's a core group, and usually this is the case each year, of a handful of countries that are disproportionately imposing the greatest individual number of shutdowns. However, I'll note that you could even look at an example like Ethiopia with its couple shutdowns, where those have been in place in certain regions for years in some capacity. So there are, many ways to look at the harm and impact and scale of internet shutdowns. And you also note the shutdowns that have the countries that have shutdown numbers with an asterisk. So that means that some shutdowns from that country, or all of them, were imposed by parties outside of the location. And we'll get into that in a little bit, what exactly it means and who those parties are. So I'll talk a little bit about what triggers an internet shutdown. Well, what is a trigger? So we consider that an incident or a context where authorities are more likely to impose shutdowns, essentially. And for 2 years in a row now, conflict has been the top trigger. you can see it's significantly increased in the past few years in places around the world, which is a very alarming trend because through shutdowns and conflict, authorities typically shroud a lot of really heinous, grave human rights abuses, and including murder, torture, rape, and sexual violence, and sometimes apparent war crimes and atrocities in the darkness of the internet shutdowns. So this is a very, very alarming trend. And this is done through a wide range of tactics, including cutting fiber optic cables, like physical destruction of fiber optic cables, as well as general power and telecommunications infrastructure, impose and deliberate fuel embargoes and shortages, using jamming devices, physically taking over ISP offices, deploying cyber attacks, and also the disabling or seizure of low Earth orbit satellite internet terminals during conflict. I'll also add, and this is not just during conflict, but can be during other triggers of shutdowns, that of that whole set of nearly 300 shutdowns in 2024, 72 of these were coinciding with grave human rights abuses. So the use of shutdowns to enable and try to conceal atrocities is an incredibly alarming trend that we're seeing around the world. So we have a couple more triggers here, protests. This has been a pretty common context for authorities to shut down the internet over many years. But we see very often that this technique is used to specifically target marginalized groups, perhaps during self-determination protests, but really a wide range of protests at all levels of engagement, sometimes smaller, more localized protests to entire national movements that authorities, reach for internet shutdowns and use different excuses like national security and different justifications to say why they're doing this. And there's just countless examples. So this is still incredibly common globally. Also during school exams, this is, I think, one that people might not be super aware of, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. There are significant internet shutdowns during the summer months to try to prevent exam cheating, which has been shown to be quite ineffective and a very, very disproportionate harmful measure while they're shutting down the internet. I think Iraq, they do nationwide shutdowns during exam days, which would be, pretty hard to picture how that would be effective. But then there's also a couple new countries like Kenya blocked Telegram the past couple years during their school exams. So we see that pretty consistently as well. Election-related shutdowns. So there was an uptick in 2024, partially a result of 2024 being a huge election year, but also there had been a decrease over multiple years, kind of contrary to some other trends we had seen with other triggers as a result of a lot of international outcry for how election-related shutdowns disrupted electoral processes. And there was a lot of international pressure building in that regard, as well as really successful campaigning, some of which Felicia will talk about in a little bit. But still, election-related shutdowns are still happening in all corners of the globe and are very harmful for democracy. So here are a few specific cases. So I was referencing cross-border shutdowns, and this became really prevalent in 2024, although it was happening in years prior as well, where perpetrators were implementing shutdowns outside of their borders, either in times of conflict or in other contexts during protests. So the first one would be the shutdowns imposed by Russia during their military campaign, legal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, either through cyber attacks or the destruction of power infrastructure, with the intent of shutting down the internet, with huge damage for civilians. There's been a high number, I think, over 20 to 25 now, since October 2023, by Israel with their war on Gaza, that they, through a variety of methods, shut down the internet for Gaza, cut them off from the world entirely. And the ones in 2024 coinciding with where they're focusing their military campaigns. And for both cases, but particularly in Gaza, trying to conceal many atrocities against civilians. In Myanmar, which we'll talk a little bit about more in a second, in addition to the high number of shutdowns imposed by the junta government, they also had cross-border shutdowns happening from Thailand and China. So with the situation there being pretty desperate to try to get internet access along those borders, a lot of people resort to using Thai internet providers or Chinese providers, and authorities on those side of the borders will shut down the internet, which is extremely harmful. One moment. So we saw that happening in border areas of Myanmar. Some cyber attacks happening from an anonymous hacker group that took credit for shutting down the internet in a few countries. Protests in Kenya in summer 2024 resulted in, because they wanted it to look like an accidental cable cut, which are very common around the world, particularly in Africa. And because they tampered with subcable node access, it actually cut off the internet across the course of a day for 4 other countries. And then a couple other examples, with Turkey cutting off the internet in northern Syria during protests, as well as Ukraine imposing a cyber attack on Russian state media, television, and internet. So you can read more about these cases in our annual report and data set if you want any more detail. We're also happy to answer any questions. So I have a handful of examples before I pass off to Felicia. There were 7 new offenders that we found in 2024. So in Thailand, I mentioned the cross-border shutdowns. And really their stated aim was to curb cybercrime. They have a lot of scam call centers along these border towns with Myanmar. However, they're very much affecting local residents and vulnerable populations that are trafficked to work there. Mauritius had a pretty sweeping social media platform blocking order, and definitely a little bit of a success for the campaign. That order was lifted after a day because there was an outcry by local and international rights groups, but that was the first time they had imposed a shutdown. And then France, which is a member of the Freedom Online Coalition, blocked access to TikTok in the overseas territory of New Caledonia. There were independence movements being led. There are the independence protests being led by the indigenous Kanak people against voting reforms. And so France shut down TikTok in an overseas territory. There was also Comoros, El Salvador, Guinea-Bissau, and Malaysia were also all first-time offenders. So I mentioned in Myanmar a little bit. This was the first time since 2018 that India wasn't the leader of the total number of shutdowns, individual shutdowns imposed, which is not a great record to try to beat. So the vast majority of these, 74, were imposed by the military junta. at least 17 of which were correlated with airstrikes on villages with civilians on purpose. So people in Myanmar and in these towns that are undergoing the war will learn that if the internet cuts out, bombs are about to fall. Other perpetrators involved included China and Thailand, which I mentioned before, as well as some of the like joint resistance forces within areas they controlled, just a few shutdowns from them. We also saw that low Earth orbit satellite internet services, because obviously with the rampant number of internet shutdowns happening in Myanmar, people were resorting to alternative connectivity, that these are now being targeted with shutdowns as well as authorities, particularly the junta, finds that people are using new types of internet service, not just terrestrial ISPs. But India still had a pretty unacceptable number imposed at the state and local level, particularly during protests and communal violence. So lastly, a couple more examples, and there are many more highlighted in our report, which I encourage people to take a look at, would be in Sudan, where during the civil war, there was at the very least 4 shutdowns during 2024, all of which coincided with serious human rights abuses from the RSF and Sudanese armed forces at a national level, as well as a couple more localized regional shutdowns, and likely very many more shutdowns as people experienced during the course of fighting across the country. And then lastly, in Equatorial Guinea, in the island province of Annobon, there's been a shutdown since July 2024, so we're coming up on 1 year of the shutdown. There were protests led by environmental activists against the government, as well as widespread arrests and prosecution of human rights offenders. So we have a campaign going that Felicia will talk a little bit more about to try to press the Equatorial Guinean authorities and other stakeholders to urgently end the shutdown. So I think, oh yeah, 2025, of course. So I have a few examples here. We don't have the full data that we do for 2024 because we haven't gone through that process fully for 2025, obviously, even for the first half of the year. But a few notable cases there were, so looking at new offenders, Albania started blocking TikTok. Lithuania started blocking VK, which is a Russian platform, which was already blocked in Latvia and Ukraine for many years. Panama, which was very disappointing to see, they did a full internet and communications shutdown in the Bocas del Toro region at the end of June for, I think, about a week. That was the first for that country. And then the US decided to, there was a TikTok and ByteDance blocking or removal of those apps from major app stores for about 14 hours back in January, based on the law that was written to block and ban TikTok from the country if it wasn't sold. So those are the new offenders, and we're happy to talk about these or any others from 2024. But I think I'll pass it off to Felicia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach, for providing the overview. Yeah, in order to, I'm going to provide some positive developments with regards to our advocacy against internet shutdowns. And so in 2025, we've already documented a number of milestones, and even before that. So for instance, the Freedom Online Coalition has put out a statement affirming the importance of an open and secure internet access during armed conflicts. As Zach indicated, this is really important for advocacy because we've seen an increasing number of shutdowns being deployed during armed conflicts and the devastating impact that has on people. And so we really, really welcome the statement by the Freedom Online Coalition. Through our advocacy, we also saw South Sudan end an internet shutdown that was supposed to last 90 days earlier this year, when authorities ordered internet service providers in the country to shut down social media for 90 days in response to protests. But then through advocacy, that decision was overturned in about 4 days, and internet access was restored across the country. The KeepItOn Coalition partners have also recently welcomed a ruling by the ECOWAS courts denouncing the use of internet shutdowns by authorities in Senegal in 2023 and 2024. And this is the fourth time the ECOWAS court has condemned internet shutdowns and upheld fundamental rights following civil society litigation against governments with examples in Nigeria, Togo, and Guinea. And then also we have our partners in and out of Kenya that have filed a lawsuit against the government of Kenya and ISPs in the country following shutdowns in Kenya. Kenya used to be a leading example of countries that had not deployed or used internet shutdowns. But in recent years, it's been a different story. Since 2023, 2024, and even this month, during protests, we've seen the government impose internet disruptions. And so in response to this, the High Court also has issued orders preventing the governments from shutting down the internet pending the determination of the case. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case because we have documented recent shutdowns in Kenya in connection with the ongoing protests in the country. Next slide, please, Zach. Okay, so as Zach mentioned, in response to prolonged shutdowns in Annobon, which is a very tiny island in Equatorial Guinea, Access Now and the KeepItOn Coalition just launched a campaign last week, and we are demanding international community to join us in demanding an end to the ongoing shutdown that began in Annobon in July 2024 and is still ongoing. We do not want this shutdown to hit the 1-year mark, and so we are galvanizing all the support that we can to push back. And so we have a petition that is still open for sign-ons for those who are interested in supporting, as well as a blog post that highlights the impact of the ongoing shutdown on people in the island and even outside the island, that you can read more to understand the context and supports our calls for an end to this very, very concerning situation in Annobon. Next slide. Okay, so I am just going to run through an initiative we call the Election Watch Initiative, and just to give a sense of how we work, or some of the strategies we use in pushing back against shutdowns. So this is the only campaign initiative that allows us to prepare in advance, given that most of the triggers of shutdowns are unpredictable. And so most of the time we respond rapidly, but with the Election Watch Initiative, we are able to plan ahead in order to engage with various stakeholders and to ensure that the internet is kept on during electoral processes in countries. We use strategies like open letters, capacity building trainings, stakeholder dialogues to ensure an open and secure internet throughout electoral processes. The campaign has also continued to underscore the importance of internet access and digital platforms throughout electoral processes and the role they play in ensuring fairness, credibility, and transparency of elections. And over, we've seen how people contest election results whenever the internet is targeted in countries across the world. Next slide. So we've monitored over 30 countries that have gone to the polls, including Senegal, the DRC, Cameroon, Tanzania, Venezuela, Russia, Azerbaijan, Zambia, and Iran through open letters and statements. And our advocacy has actually resulted in election-related shutdowns being documented in countries like Ghana, Kenya, Benin, Bangladesh, Nigeria, the DRC, Sierra Leone, and Gabon. And Zach mentioned a recent development in Mauritius, where we were able to put an end to a shutdown that was supposed to last longer. And then also in Zambia, we got authorities to lift shutdowns that were in place. For instance, in 2024, last year, we welcomed also commitments by authorities in Bangladesh to keep it on prior to elections. And then, of course, this was followed throughout the elections. But unfortunately, later in the year, we saw the government imposing internet shutdowns to call protests that happened in the country. And there's ongoing investigation into that particular internet shutdown. And we are hoping to see perpetrators of the shutdown in Bangladesh being held accountable. Next. Yes. Through our advocacy and engagement with the Freedom Online Coalition via the Task Force on Internet Shutdowns, which was launched in 2021, we also got the FOC to publish a statement towards the end of 2023. And this was timely ahead of the year of election, which we observed in 2024. And so it was important for us to have the statements from the Freedom Online Coalition. And then in March 2024, we also had the African Commission on Human and People's Rights also adopt a resolution on election-related shutdowns and appealed to member states to refrain from imposing internet shutdowns during elections. All right, so this is one of our trainings we had. I think this was in Ghana, ahead of elections, to engage with civil society and media to be aware of internet shutdowns and to push the government of Ghana to uphold fundamental rights. And this was the case throughout the elections in Ghana. I think that is it, and we are open to take questions. I think if we have some recommendations for various stakeholder groups in our annual reports with the link here and also included in the resources attached to this presentation. So you can go through them and feel free to reach out to us if you need more resources on our advocacy against shutdowns. All right, happy to take some questions now. I think we ran over time, but we hope it was useful for all of you. Thank you.